Poppy started finding the hairs the day after we got back. We'd been on holiday to Myanmar, our first big trip together. Poppy and I have been going out 3 years, and we finally moved in together last month. We'd been planning that trip ever since. Looking back now, it feels like the holiday happened to someone else, to some other couple. We visited temples in Bagan and saw sights in Yangon, sunbathed beside Inle Lake, even went skinny dipping after a few cocktails when the rest of the hotel was dark and quiet in the early hours. Trekking too. That was my favourite thing. We went on a handful of group hikes through the villages and the countryside, following a guide through fields of chili and ginger. We slept under the stars. I guess holidays like that can sometimes cause problems in a relationship. After 2 solid, occasionally exhausting weeks together, I imagine cracks started to show with some couples. But it wasn't like that for me and Poppy. The whole trip brought us closer together. It was the happiest I've been in years. But the day after we got back, things changed. That was when Poppy began finding the hairs. They were in her mouth when she woke up. I still remember the first morning she told me. It was the day we were both due back at work, and I found her standing in her bathroom by the sink, frozen in front of the mirror. She was still in her pajamas, and she didn't glance up when I came in. "Aren't you getting dressed?" I asked. "We're going to miss the train if we don't leave in 10, sweetheart." Poppy blinked. Her eyes found mine in the mirror. She had a slight frown on her face, and I thought at first she hadn't heard me. Then she held out her left hand with the palm facing up. "So weird," she muttered. 3 white hairs lay across it. They were short, maybe an inch long, slightly crinkled. My parents have a white Jack Russell cross, and they reminded me a bit of the hairs she sometimes left on my coat when I went to visit. "What's that? Are you molting?" I'd meant it as a joke, but Poppy didn't laugh. Her eyes flicked down from mine to the hairs in her hand, then back to mine again. She pulled her face. "This is going to sound super gross, but, well, I don't even get how it happened." "I found them in my mouth. I could feel something tickling me when I woke up. It's so gross. It was like that feeling when you get a hair in a mouthful of food." She grimaced. "Where do you think they came from?" I frowned down at the hairs in her hand, then shrugged, glanced at my watch. "I dunno. Probably off that light grey jumper of yours or something. Who knows? We'd better make a move anyway." Poppy leaned forward and turned on the tap, held her left hand under it, and watched the hairs wash off her skin and down the plug hole. Her next words were half mumbled, and I almost missed them beneath the sound of the water. "That jumper's shoved in a cupboard somewhere. Haven't worn it in a year." As I write this now, a big part of me hates myself. I hate myself for not taking it more seriously. The whole thing happened fast once it started. It's true, and I don't even know if I'd have been able to stop it anyway. But I could have tried. I could have rushed her to the doctor early on, if not after that first morning, then at least after she began showing other symptoms. The next day, it was stomach aches. Poppy didn't mention hairs to me again. Not that morning, at least. But when I went to wake her for work, she told me she wasn't going in. She had sharp pains in her belly, she said. Had been getting them all night. Barely slept. I kissed her forehead and told her to get plenty of rest. Said it was probably the chicken she'd ate last night, or one of those 24-hour bugs. I told her to get some sleep, and it would get better. It didn't get better. When I returned from work 9 hours later, eyes stinging and tired, Poppy was still in bed. She moaned a half-greeting when I came into the room, but didn't open her eyes. I woke up the next day to see Poppy sat up in bed beside me. Her dark hair was stuck to her forehead in sweaty clumps. Her eyes were half lidded with sleep. I don't get this. Her voice sounded weak and gravelly. She stared down at her hands, which were cupped in front of her. Her forehead creased in a frown. More of those damn hairs, the same white ones again. She turned to me as I sat up in bed, and for the first time, I saw something more than confusion on her face. Something approaching fear. I started to mumble some sleepy response, but she cut me off. I had them yesterday too, Chris. I remember half waking when your alarm went off and feeling them there. 3 small hairs on my tongue and one between my back teeth. She shuddered. It doesn't make sense. Before I had a chance to say anything, she groaned. She screwed her eyes shut, leaned forward with her arms clutched around her belly. I put my hand on her arm and waited for the pain to pass. After a few seconds had gone, she straightened again and turned to look at me. No better? The question seemed stupid, obvious, but it was all I could think to say. Poppy frowned. I felt like I slept a bit better last night, but when I woke up this morning, the pain was back. It comes in waves, but it's still there. Before I left for work, we agreed that she'd book a doctor's appointment. Later, sat at my desk as the afternoon stretched on and the minutes dragged, I did some Googling. Symptoms. The NHS website, WebMD. None of it helped. There were too many possibilities, ranging from mild stomach bugs to things I didn't even want to consider. And when I added the white hairs, nothing came up. The thing at the back of my mind, the thing I didn't want to pay too much attention to, even though I knew I couldn't ignore it, was the holiday. Our trip to Myanmar. Because you heard stories, didn't you? Travellers who came back home with weird tropical illnesses. People ignored a tiny bite or a sting, only for it to turn into something worse. I'd even had a similar conversation with a guide on one of our treks. Kin, his name had been. We'd got talking one night over a cigarette, which we passed back and forth outside the home of the villagers who were putting our group up for the night. The conversation had started with his job, then moved on to tourism in the area, to some of the stupid things he'd seen people do. Some people, they do not have any sense of respect, Kin had said. I can still remember the way the tip of his cigarette glowed in the night, the trail of smoke drifting up from his silhouette. They do not understand that they are guests in someone else's home, or that the area they are in can be dangerous. They want to pet stray dogs. They want to take photos of snakes. He turned to me and grinned, teeth shining in the dark. I actually had one woman who did that. We saw a viper in the path. Very dangerous. and she wanted me to take a picture of her with a snake in it. I laughed quietly. "You're serious?" Kin nodded. "We always get these people. All the time, my friends are seeing this. They take stupid risks, go up to wild animals, swim in lakes they shouldn't swim in, walk in places they shouldn't walk." My mind suddenly flashed back to mine and Poppy's skinny dipping session in the hotel in Inlay, and a pang of guilt went through me. I didn't say anything. "All the time, and they don't know the dangers," Kin continued. "Hidden dangers. You can get bitten by something, maybe a wild dog, rabies, poisonous snakes, spiders that lay eggs in a cut, parasites in the water. My country, it needs the tourism, but it is, how do you say in England? Like a sword with two edges, good and bad." He paused and took another drag on the cigarette before handing it back to me. "Some people, they don't respect the land. They don't understand that there are old places here, old things that have been here long before them and should not be disturbed." Poppy was worse when I got home that day. Quite a lot worse. Barely spoke. Wouldn't eat the soup I made her. She had this smell on her breath when I bent to kiss her that was sort of spoiled. Like meat that's been left out on the side for too long. The only thing I got out of her was that she'd booked a doctor's appointment for the following afternoon. And I have to admit, that made me feel a bit better at the time. When I eventually joined her in bed a few hours later, she was fast asleep. Something woke me in the night. A noise. Sort of a half-heard rustling that blended with the dream I was having. I struggled up from sleep like a swimmer, dragging themselves to the surface of the water. The room was dark, and at first, I couldn't get my bearings. I could still hear the scrambling noise I'd heard in my dream, and it took my mind a moment to realize I was awake. Scritch, scratch, a soft rustling. It sounded close. One of the old houses I lived in as a student once had a rat infestation, and that was the first place my mind went. Little scurrying feet in the walls maybe, or under the floor. That was wrong though, and I knew it was wrong. The noise was soft, but it wasn't behind the walls. It was closer than that. I turned onto my back, the bed creaking beneath my body. The noise stopped. I stared into the darkness, ears pricked, but I couldn't hear anything. The room was silent. Then I saw a hint of movement from the corner of my eye. I tilted my face in Poppy's direction and felt my breath catch in my throat. Her head was the wrong shape. Staring at her silhouette, that was the first thought to shoot across my mind. She looked wrong. I could only make out her outline in the room's thick darkness, but the shape of her head was lumpy, like an extra jut of bone was sprouting from the place her mouth should be. I closed my eyes, hard, trying to force the sleep out of them, and two things happened at once. Poppy's dark shape shifted in the bed, and a whining noise, a soft, high-pitched keening, issued from her side of the bed. Then it broke off into a coughing fit as she rolled onto her side. Poppy spluttered, pulling in little, hitching half-breaths, and coughed some more. I held my breath. I suddenly had the horrible idea that she might be choking in her sleep, her throat clogged with a mixture of phlegm and those tiny white hairs she kept pulling from her mouth. But after a few more seconds, the coughing petered out. I lay frozen in bed, fully awake now, listening, straining my ears for those soft rustling sounds. But the only noise I could hear was Poppy's breathing. That was last night. It feels like it happened years ago. But there it is. Less than 24 hours. Less than one full day for my life to be ripped apart. I need to write this next bit fast now. I have to get it down. If I think too much about it or hesitate, I know I'll lose my nerve. I left for work as usual this morning. Just that sentence alone makes me feel sick with guilt. But it's true. I didn't ring the hospital or drive Poppy to A&E like I now know I should have done. I just got dressed and walked out the door like it was another day. I could tell you it was Poppy's doctor's appointment, which I knew was coming up, or the fact that she was fast asleep when I kissed her goodbye. But neither of those things make me feel better. I think a big part of me knew something was wrong, even then. Seriously wrong. But the rest of me didn't want to admit it. The feeling didn't go away though. As the hours ticked by at work, and I didn't hear anything from Poppy, it grew. I told myself she'd be sleeping, and then I told myself she'd be busy at her appointment. But it didn't help. By the time 5 o'clock hit, and I finally left the office, I was practically running. I knew something was wrong as soon as I got to our front door. Before then, actually. I could hear Poppy's ragged coughs echoing down the hall as I reached the corridor outside our flat. They were worse than they'd been the night before, those coughs. Much worse. I didn't know if it was the acoustics of the hall distorting them, but to me, they barely sounded human. I fumbled my key into the lock and burst through the front door, staggered along the hall to the source of the sound. The bathroom. Poppy was on her knees in front of the toilet, hands clutching the porcelain. Her hair hung around her face in sweaty black curtains, and she coughed over and over again. Her whole body shook with the force of them. "Sweetheart, She turned to me, half turned towards the sound of my voice. And as soon as I got a glimpse of her face, my words died on my tongue. Poppy's skin was dark red. The tendons on her neck stood out like ropes. Strands of hair stuck to her forehead, framing and half obscuring her bloodshot eyes. I could see the fear in those eyes, something fast approaching terror. Poppy opened her mouth, and I stared on in horror as a runnel of blood spilled from the corner of it. A low moan issued from deep in her throat, a sound filled with pain and panic. I had my hand in my pocket, struggling to free my smartphone, when she collapsed. Her hand slipped from the toilet, and she crashed sideways into the tiles. Poppy's whole body jerked and shook. Her face was turned towards me, mouth open. A strangled gurgling issued from it. I was unlocking my phone, fingers slipping across the screen, when I saw something in the dark cave of her throat. There was a white shape in there. It stood out in the blackness of her mouth, some blockage, My first thought was that it looked like a dull knob of bone, maybe food lodged against the windpipe. Then it moved. It wasn't Poppy's shaking that caused it to shift. The thing in her throat moved on its own. I could see it, writhing and twisting in there. My phone slipped from my hands. I dropped down onto my knees beside Poppy, already cupping her face in one hand. By this point, her skin had changed to an angry shade of purple, and I could no longer hear her breathing. I guess I had the idea that I was going to reach down her throat and pull out whatever it was out of there, clear her airways. But as I twisted her face towards mine so I could look into her mouth, I saw that I wouldn't need to, because the thing was coming out on its own. I will never, ever get the image of what I saw in Poppy's mouth out of my mind. Not ever. I can see it now, clearly when I shut my eyes. A nightmare reel of images that are going to play and play and play like a horror film stuck on loop. Back before we discovered we had a rat infestation at university, we used to keep our bin bags outside, in a pile by the back door. None of us were very good at remembering the day the rubbish was meant to go out, and some of those bags were left to stack up for weeks. I remember one day, going outside with a fresh bag to dump, that I heard rustling in the black pile, a soft scrabbling sound. I thought it was the wind at first, but when I went to drop the bag in my hands, I saw a hole that had been ripped in one of the older sacks, a jagged mouth in the bin liner. As I stared at that hole, I have a clear memory of seeing the plump head of a rat nosing its way out. That was the memory that flew across my mind as I stared into Poppy's mouth. That fat brown rat worming its way out of the bag. Only what I saw in the bathroom, what I saw dragging its way from the wet darkness of Poppy's throat, was far, far worse. It was about the same size as a rat, but that's where the similarities end. Its fur was white for one thing, a dirty off-white, with streaks of blood and half-digested food clinging to the bristles. As it propelled itself forward, wriggling its body over Poppy's tongue, I saw that it didn't have feet. The thing had legs, but they were long and thin, closer to the legs of a spider than a rodent. Lots of legs. They writhed and scrambled for purchase in Poppy's mouth. All of that was terrible, but it wasn't the worst thing. The worst thing was the creature's face. It was sort of crumpled in, a brown pulp of flesh that looked like a tumour in the sea of white hair. A tumour with 3 unblinking yellow eyes. I fell backwards, away from Poppy. Something in my mind felt like it was slipping. An all rational thought of clearing Poppy's airways or calling an ambulance had temporarily left me. All I could do was sit on the cold tiles, staring. The creature whined. It was a high-pitched, mewling sound that made the skin on my neck itch. The thing's nest of black legs scrambled for purchase on Poppy's lower lip, finally dragging its rodent-like body free of her mouth. I used my hands to scrabble backwards as the thing fell to the tiles. Have you ever seen a cockroach move? They don't look like they should be fast, but they are. The white creature crouched in front of Poppy's unmoving form like that, One moment it was still, the next it was scuttling towards me. But the fear at seeing it come at me, I hardly even had a chance to register before it scampered straight by, legs clicking against the tiles as it fled the bathroom. I caught a glimpse of it scurrying across our bedroom, scaling the curtains in a white-black blur, and then it was gone. Through the half-open window and into the night. I don't remember calling the ambulance. I must have done it though, because at some point, I remember a paramedic taking my arm. I sat with Poppy at the time, talking to her while I stroked her hair. I didn't hear them come in. I think I already knew. She was dead by then. She hadn't moved in a long time, and her skin felt cold. I don't remember much of what happened next, but I remember one of the paramedics leading me into our lounge and sitting me on the sofa, talking to me. I guess I talked back, but I can't remember what I said. The only thing I do remember was insisting that I wasn't going to come with them if they left. I said I'd follow on after, even though I didn't know where they were going. I might have screamed at him. For a long time after they'd gone, before I started writing all this, I just sat, staring into space, thinking about what I should have done and didn't do, thinking about that thing growing in Poppy's stomach, thinking about the conversation I had with Kin, what seems like a lifetime ago, when he told me about the old things of this world, things that shouldn't be disturbed. I need to go soon. I need to make calls, tell people about Poppy, follow the paramedics. I'm not sure I can though. That's the thing. I'm not sure I can leave this flat. A big part of me wants to walk out the door and never come back here again. But another part, quite a large part actually, keeps thinking about the darkness outside the window. That same darkness the white thing disappeared into. The white, scuttling creature that even now must be out there somewhere, maybe lurking in the sewers or squeezed into some dark crack in a wall. Waiting. Click here to end simulation 1815251820. That was the subject of the email I'd just received. No message, no joke, just a link to click. I peeked around the room, looking for the culprit of yet another practical joke. Our floor was massive, just about big enough to house about 300 cubicles. But Robert, who'd sent me the message, was nowhere in sight. One of my neighbors chuckled. I diverted my attention towards the sound. Maybe they were in on it too. It wasn't uncommon for us to make our own fun, as our boss hardly paid attention, and work was fairly monotonous, always tapping away at our company-provided computers, using their own brand keyboards and headsets, all marked with a simple logo AP. Just as I was about to trash the email, Robert returned to the floor. He gave me a glance and smiled. The same mischievous look I'd seen 100 times before. He was a funny guy, always inventing his own harmless pranks for a cheap laugh. So, once I'd practically confirmed that the email was his doing and not some malicious virus, I clicked the link. Do you confirm the termination of 1815251820? I sighed, a tired smile stretching across my face. What ridiculous prank could it be? I clicked yes and looked over at his cubicle, Robert had frozen in place. His smile had vanished, and he just stared in my general direction, not moving a muscle. "Rob, what are you doing?" I asked, still awaiting the punchline of the joke. Then, he simply vanished. He didn't leave. He didn't duck down behind his desk. No, he simply disappeared without a trace. I stood up from my chair and walked over, confused and mildly terrified. None of my co-workers had flinched at the event. All of them just sat there in their cubicles, diligently typing away, filling the office with background noise. "What are you doing? Our break hasn't started yet," Jennifer said as she noticed me pacing around. "You didn't see that?" I asked. "See what?" "Robert. He just vanished into thin air." "Who?" It could have been an elaborate prank, but even if the whole office was in on it, I couldn't logically explain how an office worker just seemed to be erased from existence. While I contemplated different theories, I checked under his desk and looked around for suspicious-looking colleagues. In the midst of my search for answers, a ping sounded from my computer, alerting me to yet another email. I rushed back and opened my inbox, hoping Robert had sent me something, even if nothing more than laughing at how easily he had tricked me. But instead of Robert, Jennifer was marked as the sender. "Click here to end simulation 10514. "Alright, Jen, very funny, but please stop," I said, a bit too loud. I garnered the attention of my neighbouring co-workers, who asked me to keep quiet. Jennifer came over with an annoyed look on her face. We'd never been particularly close, but she wasn't one to shy away from a good prank, though she would never contain her emotions enough to go through with it without laughing. This was the first time I'd seen her genuinely annoyed. "Look, I don't have time for this. What's the deal with you today?" I pointed to the email, demanding an explanation, but she kept her facade going. "I didn't send that," she claimed. "Then why does it mark you as the sender?" She sat down in my chair to take a closer look. "Huh? That's weird," she said as she clicked on the link. "No, wait." I tried to stop her, but she'd already confirmed the termination. And, just like Robert, she disappeared without a trace. I stumbled back in shock. In the span of a minute, 2 of my colleagues had simply ceased to exist. I stared at my suddenly empty chair with a horrified expression on my face. By then, my co-workers had started to look at me with concerned eyes, oblivious to what had just happened. Before I got a chance to explain myself, another 3 pings were heard from my computer. 3 new emails, 3 new numbers. "Click to end simulation 41225 from Dave. Click here to end simulation 112935 from Alice. Click here to end simulation 112524 from Alex." They had come from 3 of my co-workers, all of them unaware, their heads still glued to their computer screens, diligently tapping away at their keyboards. "James, my office, please." I turned around to see my boss. He'd taken note of my frantic behaviour and wanted to check up on me. "You want to tell me what's going on?" he asked as he closed the door. Sir, Robert and Jenny, They just disappeared, I stuttered. He sighed. Sit down, please. In my agitated state, I wanted to refuse. I wanted to run out and prove to him that I hadn't gone crazy. But suddenly, I just found myself sitting, obeying him without even thinking. So, they're gone, I take it you saw their numbers? Their numbers? You know about this? I asked. James, this is the end of phase 1. That's why they sent you the numbers. They're shutting us down, he said, matter-of-factly. I looked at my boss. He still smiled, unfazed by the idea that 2 of his employees had just been erased, and that 3 would soon follow. Sir, what the hell is going on here? What is phase 1? Why are we being shut down? Are we all being fired? He chuckled in response. Fired is a nice way of putting it, but it's not entirely how it works here. James, why don't you tell me what we do at this company? He asked. The question was bizarre considering the situation. We type into the computers. I couldn't give a straight answer. I thought back, firm memories of typing at my keyboard, but no memory as to why. It had always been something I did on autopilot. I never thought about the task at hand. He noticed my confusion. Exactly, James. And how long have you been with us? How long? I've been here for... I didn't know. I'd never thought about the time past. It could have been years, or it could have been a week. I don't understand, I finally said, with terror in my voice. My boss put a comforting hand on my shoulder. He'd been sitting in the chair just in front of me, but now suddenly, he stood behind me. We couldn't perfectly reconstruct your mind, but you were a great start, a perfect way to prove that our company had a great future. What the hell are you talking about? Think back, James. What brought you here? How did we meet? What's my name? The barrage of questions rendered me speechless for a moment. I couldn't recall even the most basic information. You're my boss. Your name is... I didn't know. He went to grab me a glass of water to calm me down. I grabbed it with trembling hands and realized I couldn't remember the last time I drank anything, or ate for that matter. You remember going to the hospital? You had a malignant brain tumor. You came to us for help, he said calmly. I don't remember. We couldn't fix you, James. We didn't have the tools yet, but we did our best to put your mind in a place where it could keep living. You said you wanted to keep living. I stared at the window behind my boss's desk. Its curtains were bright from the sun shining inside, but that was just it. Beyond the light, I couldn't see anything. No streets outside, no sky, nothing. My mind slowly started to settle on the idea that everything around me had been specifically made only to distract me from the truth, that nothing existed beyond the boundaries of our office. My co-workers, they're not real. I'm not real either. I basically screamed in panic as reality set in. No, 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 James. Of course you're real. You're just as real as myself. But you're not exactly physical. It takes some time for the mind to accept the loss of its body. But don't worry, we're still working on that. The loss of my body. What did that even mean? I looked down, still seeing my hands, my legs, everything where it was supposed to be. Yet the messages I'd received, and simulation, had been firmly locked in my mind. I know it's a lot to take in, but you signed the contracts. You said you wanted to take part in the trials, and though they weren't as successful as we'd hoped, we still made progress. The thing is, James, adults have lost their plasticity. Their brains just won't adapt to a new environment, which is why we've moved on to, well, younger subjects. People with more malleable minds. What the hell are you talking about? You were phase 1, but it's time to move on. He didn't give me a chance to ask any more questions. I simply found myself standing outside the office door. I pulled it open in anger, ready to unleash my boss. But behind the door, I found nothing but a brick wall. My co-workers still sat in their cubicles, ignoring the commotion going on around them. They weren't real. They never had been. They were just trapped in a bizarre simulation alongside myself. But whether or not they were human once, I didn't know. I heard more pings emitting from my computer. Dozens, if not hundreds of emails flowing in by the second. Emails, numbers, all asking me to terminate various simulations. I started clicking on each, desperately looking for my own number, trying to figure out a way to end the nightmare. After a few moments of manic clicking, I looked up from my cubicle. I was alone. Yet, the emails kept coming. Thousands of numbers, none of them mine. But I kept clicking. I kept terminating simulation after simulation, never finding my own. Then, I stopped. I realized that all of the emails had been sent from people whose simulation I had ended, which meant maybe I'd sent out my own number to someone, even if I couldn't remember it. I clicked on the sent tab of my email to find only a single message. Click here to end simulation 10113519. I clicked on it, but it didn't prompt a confirmation message. In fact, nothing happened. Only the receiver of the message had access, but the recipient field had been censored, meaning I had no idea who held my fate in their hands. Which is why I'm writing here. I'm not sure if the internet reaches outside of this simulation, or if everyone reading this is simply part of this virtual hellhole. Whatever the case, if you received my number, I'm begging you, please terminate this simulation. I don't want to be here anymore. It was dark that night. Very dark. The moon was not out, and I was driving solely by the light of my truck's headlights and the stars high above. It was a long, lonesome road I was driving down. It was covered in cracks and potholes and transitioned into gravel in some places. There was nothing but forest on either side. It was getting late, and my friend Dylan, was waiting for me at my apartment with a few cases of beer. So, I had a motivation to go a bit above the speed limit. My mind had gone into autopilot. No thoughts were passing through my head. The road just seemed to pull me forward into the hazy darkness ahead of me. Then, my engine roared suddenly and then started sputtering. My check engine light came on. It scared the hell out of me, so I almost lost control of the wheel. I slammed down on the brakes, and when it stopped, it never started again. I took in a few deep breaths and tried to straighten myself. I tried, in vain, several times to get the engine to start, but it wouldn't budge. I was mad as hell. I had had this Ford pickup for 5 years and it had never done this. I stepped out and got on the phone with Dylan and explained my situation. "Tell me where you are, Tyler. I'll come pick you up," said Dylan. "I'm on Highway 89. Just keep driving down it until you see my truck. You can't miss it," I said. "All right, I'll be there as soon as I can. I've had a few beers already, but I feel good to drive," said Dylan. "All right, just be careful," I said, then hung up the phone. That was when I saw it. I was shocked that I didn't notice it until then, considering I'd been parked for like 10 minutes. It was a cemetery. It was surrounded by forest on all sides beside the road. It had a dingy, chain-link fence surrounding it, and it was heavily overgrown with weeds and tall grass. It was clearly not being maintained. I was dumbfounded by the fact that I just didn't see it before. It was right there. And also quite noticeable, given the backdrop of nothing but forests on all sides. I figured I'd have to wait a bit for Dylan to show up, so I decided to check it out. It at least gave me something to do. I stepped through the gate and looked up at the sign. It read, "Quarterville Cemetery," in big brown letters. I got a better look around and saw that this place was just about the least well-kept cemetery I had ever been in. The grass came up to my ankles and weeds pocketed the ground. I began walking up and down the rows of graves. Most of the graves were just wooden crosses sticking out of the ground with a small plaque resting beneath it. A few were actually stone blocks with the names of the duly departed engraved into them. I glanced through them, looking at the names and the dates. Jeremy, Kaylee, Barbara, Lewis, born in 1957, 58, 43, 91. And then I came across one grave, and I stared at it in utter shock. Tyler Alden, born July 17th, 1996, died September 19th, 2019. That was my name, and the exact date I was born on. I was at the cemetery on September 18th. It said I was supposed to die the next day. I figured somebody must be trying to play a joke on me. That had to be it. There was no other good explanation. But a deep feeling of dread welled up from my stomach. I felt sick, but I didn't know why. After all, it was just a joke. Of course it was a joke. All of these thoughts and feelings were rolling through my head when I heard a voice from behind me. "I'm afraid that there is nothing that we can do for you. The extent of your injuries are too extreme." I whipped around and saw the man standing before me. He was an older man, with a bushy grey mustache and a balding head. But the strange thing was that he wore a doctor's uniform. A stethoscope hung around his neck, and he had a blue tie tucked beneath his white coat. "I can give you medicine to relieve the pain, if you feel that you need it," said the doctor. "What the hell are you talking about? Are you alright?" I asked. The man paused for a moment, and then repeated, "I'm afraid that there is nothing we can do for you." And then he repeated those phrases over and over and over again. I came to the conclusion that this man was insane. I ceased trying to get answers from him, and I turned around. I pulled out my phone to try and call Dylan again. I started to dial his number. Then I saw something swaying back and forth in the tree. Left and right, left and right. I moved closer to it to get a better look. It was a man, hanging by a thick rope from the tree. And that man was Dylan, who I thought was on his way. I immediately dropped my phone in shock. I was at a loss for words. My eyes widened and my pulse quickened. No, I said. I had a horrible mix of grief and dread wash through me in that moment. I looked back at the doctor, who had stopped repeating the full phrase, but instead repeated the beginning. "I'm afraid that there is nothing that we can do for you. I'm afraid that there is nothing we can do for you. I'm afraid that there is nothing we can do for you," said the doctor, and he continued on after that. I ran back to my truck, crushing something on the ground next to me. I ran right through that rickety old gate. I tried once again to get it to start, but it wouldn't budge. I then tried to call 911, but I couldn't find my phone. I then realized what I did. That was the object I had stepped on. I punched the steering wheel in anger. I stepped back out of my truck and walked back to the cemetery just to confirm that I had, in fact, accidentally destroyed my phone. I walked past the doctor, who was still repeating that sentence as I went. His words almost started to blur together and blend into a white noise that I hardly noticed by this point. My phone was quite clearly useless by that point, but my broken phone was not what had caught my attention in that moment. In the corner of the graveyard, curled up in a ball, but facing away from me, was a person. Its back was a mix of brown, purple and black. Its lower side had no skin, revealing grimy bones and rotting organs. It filled the air with a stench of rot and decay. I was dumbstruck with fear. I couldn't even move, not even when the rotting man stood up straight, not even when he began to turn around, and not even when I realized that the decomposed man was me. I could tell it was me. It had my jawline and facial structure. Its torso looked like a heavy object had crushed it, causing it to cave inwards. I could see a portion of the rib cage. That was when it moved towards me. And that was when I unfroze and ran in the opposite direction. Its pace quickened, and I heard it run after me. It made a creaking sound as it ran, and it stumbled and limped as it did so. It was still able to run almost unnaturally fast though. The voice of the doctor suddenly grew louder. I jumped out of the gate and towards the street. I looked behind me as the creature stopped by the gate. The doctor and the decomposed me started to slowly turn to dust and then were blown into the wind. Their faces crumpled and dissolved, as was the rest of their bodies. I was still running towards the street, and I yelped with joy when they vanished. And that was when I got hit by a truck. I was thrown about 30 feet in the opposite direction and skidded across the road. I blacked out. I woke up the next day in the hospital. I was hooked up to a respiratory machine and had numerous tubes sticking out of my chest. I had an enormous amount of pain from almost everywhere in my body. It was quite difficult to speak, except for a faint hissing sound. I could, with great difficulty, move my right arm, but that was about it. I looked over and saw my sister sitting in the chair next to me. She clutched my arm. "Don't worry, Tyler. You're going to be okay. The doctors will have you out of here in no time. I'm sure of it," she said. Even as she said it, I knew that wasn't true. "What happened?" I managed to just barely croak out. "Dylan was driving down that road to come pick you up, but he must have not seen you. They said that he had alcohol in his system. He hit you head on. Dylan apparently thought you were already dead. He was so guilty that he hung himself from a tree not too far from the road," she said. Right when she said that, the doctor walked in. It was the man from the cemetery. My heart rate on the monitor spiked, and I wanted to call for help. The doctor rattled on about my injuries and damage. Then, he said it. "I'm afraid that there is nothing we can do for you." I have fostered 3 children through my state so far. The first 2 were very young and didn't stay longer than several months before being reunited with their own families. Both were cases where the parents were convicted of a petty drug offense and had to straighten out their lives before they could have their kids back. There was no abuse reported from their caseworker. I met those parents, and they really seemed like decent people that did love their children, but made some bad choices and had to pay dearly for them. I was glad to see them reunited. The kids were ecstatic to be returned to their own mummies and daddies. It was heartwarming. Then I took in Marcy. I kept her for less than 1 week. Mr. Dennis, the caseworker I dealt with, had warned me that Marcy's case was different than the others. Marcy's mother had an ongoing case for neglect and abuse. Mr. Dennis said she was an alcoholic that confided to him once she never wanted Marcy and resented having to take care of her. On several visits, she had taken out her parrot to show Mr. Dennis and doted lovingly on it, while Marcy stood quietly in the corner. When Mr. Dennis asked Marcy's mother why she didn't put Marcy up for adoption, she simply answered that no one would want her. A few days before I spoke with Mr. Dennis about the placement, the agency received a call from a concerned neighbour that reported that they thought the girl had been left alone. For 2 weeks, there had been no activity at the house. No one coming or going, no lights on at night. Marcy's mother's car was still there, but the house seemed deserted, and with a mother's history of neglect, the neighbour asked if they could do a well check. When Mr. Dennis arrived, escorted by 2 police officers, it seemed like Marcy's mother had indeed left. She was gone, as well as a beloved parrot, and the house was in complete disarray. The utilities had been turned off. The stench was overpowering. They found Marcy curled up, sleeping in a filthy bathtub, surrounded by her own feces. They summarized that she'd been drinking the toilet water, and that's why she had gone to the bathroom on the floor. Marcy had neither a blanket or pillow in the tub with her, but was covered in what seemed to be bird feathers. Mr. Dennis said it was the saddest thing he ever saw. They didn't know what she had eaten, as there was no food in the cabinets, and what little food that had been in the fridge had spoiled. The police reported to find a large kitchen knife on the counter that seemed to have been smeared with a substance that resembled dried blood. They would run some tests on it, but it would take a while to get the results. They searched the premises and found no sign of Marcy's mother. When Mr. Dennis brought Marcy to me, he filled me in on a few more details about her. She didn't speak much at all. She was 9 years old, but had the vocabulary of a 2-year-old. She could only say a limited amount of words, basically things like no, potty, and drink, to let you know when she needed something. He also warned me that she did not react well to public places. She suffered panic attacks when placed around too many people at once, more than likely a side effect of never leaving her own home. She was very thin, and honestly, not the cutest kid I had ever seen. My first 2 days with Marcy were uneventful. I work from home and schedule my own hours, so I was able to dedicate a lot of time to making Marcy feel comfortable. I tried to get her interested in all of the usual things I've done in the past. Things like colouring, playing with Play-Doh, and of course I had toys. But Marcy seemed disinterested in all these things and barely participated. The kids I had before were younger than her, so I tried a different approach. I painted her fingernails and braided her hair, and even applied a little pink lip gloss and light blush to her face. When I was done, she glanced in the hand mirror I held up, then just left to go sit on the floor by the TV and stared at me until I turned it on for her. That was the only thing that held her attention, so I put on fun, educational shows made for toddlers that taught basic things like sight, words, and social skills. I don't think her mother let her watch TV at all before, if they even owned one. I had a cat named Socks that seemed to be a hit with the children before, but Marcy acted terrified of her. So I moved a cat box and food bowl into my bedroom the day Marcy had arrived, and that's where she stayed until she went missing the night of day 3. I had left my bedroom window cracked just enough so that she could traverse the fence in the yard when she pleased. She was fixed and had never attempted to run away before. I was devastated, but tried to just focus my attention and energy on Marcy. Marcy was extremely picky about food. She wouldn't touch anything I home cooked. She looked at it with a disgusted expression and requested one thing: crackers. I didn't currently have any crackers at home, so I tried some frozen meals such as pizza, chicken nuggets, and kids' meals. She would hardly taste the food, moving it around on her plate. Every once in a while, she would fork a tiny bit into her mouth, make a face, and say the same thing: crackers. She literally only ate enough to sustain life the first 2 days, so I called a friend and asked if they would bring over some saltines for me the next day. There was one other thing that seemed to hold her attention. Even though she didn't like the food I made for her, Marcy seemed to enjoy watching me cook for myself. Crackers? She seemed to question as she looked from the raw chicken I'd removed from the fridge. I calmly explained that, no, it wasn't crackers I was preparing, it was chicken. And she was welcome to have some after I cooked it. I threw it in a heated pan on the stove and it started to sizzle. She lost interest and wandered into the living room. That night, something weird happened. It was 4 o'clock in the morning. I woke, having to pee, and when I sat up in bed, I saw Marcy peering at me through the crack in my door. It startled me, and to be honest, it was a bit creepy. It didn't have the feeling of a child scared in the night coming for help from an adult. It was more like she was watching me sleep. I got up and steered her back to her own room, tucked her in, and explained to her there was a rule about wandering the house at night. She was only to get out of bed to use the restroom, and if she needed me, to call for me. She nodded and laid down. As I was leaving, I turned to glance at her, and her eyes were wide. She didn't look sleepy at all. She just lay there, staring at the door. The next day, my friend delivered the crackers, and I presented them to Marcy, expecting her to gobble them down. Instead, she took one, nibbled a little, and looked at me. "Crackers," she said. I agreed with her. Yes, crackers, just like she wanted. Wasn't she happy with her snack? "Crackers," she said, and she set the half-eaten saltine on the table and wandered over to the TV and sat down. Okay, well, maybe she wanted a different kind. Saltines were kind of bland. I called my friend again and explained the situation. I asked if she would get a variety of crackers and bring them over the next day. She agreed that she would. Of course, Marcy didn't eat much that night for dinner and went to her room early. I let her be. Sometimes these kids need a little space after what they had been through. I worked on my computer for several hours before getting myself ready for bed. I went to check on Marcy to make sure she had brushed her teeth, and when I walked into her room, she quickly jumped and hid something under her bed. I knelt down, explaining she didn't have to hide things from me. I was here to help her, and we should be very open and honest with each other. I promised I wouldn't be mad as I felt under her bed for the object. I was still explaining to her about honesty when I pulled the kitchen knife out from under her bed. I choked on my words. I nervously asked her why she had it. Of course, she didn't answer me, only stared. I told her this was extremely dangerous and against the rules. I explained she could accidentally hurt herself, and she was never to touch knives in this house. She just looked at it, then looked back at me, saying nothing. I had a hard time falling asleep that night, and I thought I heard footsteps running down the hallway. But when I got up to check, Marcy was in her bed. She wasn't asleep. I asked her if she had been out of bed, and she quickly replied, no. I said I was going back to bed, and she should close her eyes and try to get some sleep. No. I smiled at this and just told her fine, but don't get up for anything but the restroom. She didn't reply, so I pulled the door shut and went back to my own bed. As I started to drift off, I swear I could hear footsteps in the hall. The next day, my friend dropped off 2 grocery bags full of all sorts of different crackers. There were Ritz crackers, goldfish crackers, even flavored saltines. I presented these to Marcy, without success. She nibbled a little bit of each type, then looked at me. "Crackers," she said, a little louder than usual. I dug into a different bag and pulled out some of those little sandwich crackers. These were peanut butter and jelly. I showed them to her, and she shook her head. I found some that were cheese. She didn't want those either. I tried Triscuits, then chicken biscuits, She just looked at them and walked over to the TV, sat down, and stared at me. I was growing increasingly frustrated. I let her watch some shows while I worked on my computer. Every once in a while, I would hear her mutter along with a learning program she watched, but her expression never changed. She never once smiled. That night, I tucked her into bed and went to take a shower. I took my time getting dressed for bed, and when I was done, I went down the hall to check on her. She was not in bed. I called out for her while searching the room. She did not reply. Before I left the room, I stopped and turned towards a bed. I knelt down and looked from where I was standing at the door. Marcy was not there, but I could see something. I walked over and reached for it without looking, and cried when my fingers touched something. I pulled my hand away and looked at it. It looked like blood, but it had started to dry and turn sticky. My heart racing, I quickly headed towards the living room to grab my phone. When I entered, I was shocked to find it had been turned upside down. The cushions were pulled from the couch and thrown around the room. Books had been pulled from the shelves and dropped on the floor. My knickknacks had been thrown out the front door, which hung ajar. I stepped out to call for Marcy. I got no response and saw no one. Now I was mad and worried. I quickly checked for her in the kitchen and she wasn't there, so that only left my room. I sprinted down the hall and into the bedroom. It was in the same state as the living room had been in. My things were all over the floor. My dresser drawers were open and the closet had been halfway pulled out. The comforter and sheets had been ripped from my bed and tossed crumpled into the corner. I was furious as I sat on my bed to take a minute to decide what my next course of action should be. I sighed deeply and put my head in my hands. Should I call the police first, or a caseworker? Then I heard a giggle. It seemed to come from behind me. I turned slowly to look, but there was nothing there. I heard it again. Not behind me, under the bed. I got on my hands and knees and pulled the dust ruffle to look. Marcy was under my bed, clutching the same kitchen knife I'd taken from her a few nights ago. She was finally smiling. I stood up and demanded she come out right now. She did. I carefully took the knife from her. She let me. She had wet herself. I escorted her to my own room. Before I laid out a fresh nightgown and underwear for her and told her to get changed, I checked her over for cuts. There were none. I softly told her to get in bed and to not leave her room again. She was no longer smiling. I went back to my room and immediately called Mr. Dennis. He didn't pick up, so I tried again. When he still didn't answer, I texted him that he had to come and get Marcy first thing in the morning. A few minutes later, he called back. I explained to him what had just happened, and he agreed that this was abnormal and potentially dangerous. He advised me to keep my bedroom door locked tonight, and he would be here early in the morning to collect her. We chatted a little more about her strange behaviours the past few days, and before we hung up, I mentioned her eating habits. I told him about the fact that she had repeatedly requested crackers to eat, but when I got them for her, she didn't want them. "That's a weird coincidence," he chuckled. Crackers was the name of a mother's parrot. I thanked him and hung up. I'm sitting here now, and I can't stop thinking about when he said they'd found her covered in feathers, and the fact that there was no food anywhere. I'm actually scared. I can hear her footsteps running up to my bedroom door. She waits there for a few minutes before I hear her move away again. Then she comes back again. I won't be sleeping tonight. The morning can't come soon enough. I hear them all the time now. The train bells, ringing loudly in my ears, persistently clanging, clanging, clanging. I've tried to get rid of them. Earphones, blasting my car stereo. Nothing, not a goddamn thing can stop that damn ringing. It keeps me awake at night. Not like I could sleep much anyway. All I know is that my life now is motel after motel, grimy sinks and sticky carpets. It doesn't really matter. All that matters is that he doesn't find me. It started 3 weeks ago. I was leaving my dad's terrible, devoid, rural town after visiting for a few days. He was a drunk. Not a mean one, but a neglectful one. Now that me and my siblings were out of the house, it didn't matter so much that he couldn't take care of anything, let alone himself. But my brother and I still visit every once in a while to check up on him, do the dishes, that sort of thing. Our sister refused to see him. Anyway, my dad's town has one road that serves as the entrance and exit. There's a rusted sign bearing the town's name that marks where the town ends and begins. Next to the sign is a railroad track. It was around dusk, and I was sitting in my idling car at the crossing, the yellow traffic light off to the left flashing, indicating the oncoming train. I could hear the bells clanging in the distance. I drummed my fingers on my steering wheel, humming out the tune to a song I barely remembered and waiting for the train to come. I noticed movement in my periphery and looked to my left, where I saw a man. He was standing very still, so still it was almost statuesque. I squinted a little harder at him, but in the dim light, all I could make out was a dirty wife beater and shoulder-length, greasy black hair. He started swaying. It looked like he was dancing, but he didn't have a partner. His arms were raised in the air, as if to be on someone's shoulders, and he waltzed around the edge of the track to the tune of the ringing bells. I thought this was a little odd, but as I said before, my dad lives in a small town and druggies were a dime a dozen. I routinely saw unusual behaviour on my visits there. Still, I rolled up my windows and locked my doors just to be safe. I sighed heavily and stared in the opposite direction of the man in search of the train. It seemed to be taking an awfully long time for this damn thing to pass by. I glanced at the man again, who had now moved to the crossing in front of my car. He continued his waltz, feet deftly stepping over the metal of the track beneath him. "What the hell is he doing?" I said aloud, my hand firmly pressed against the horn of my wheel. The man stopped, his back turned to me. I stopped honking my horn. Several seconds passed, and finally, the man turned around, hips rotating before feet, and my stomach dropped at the face of the thing in my headlights. His face was marred, cuts occupying so much skin that he was made mostly of scar tissue than actual skin. He had sores on his cheeks and forehead, oozing pus and blood. And his smile, that rotten grin, will haunt every waking thought I have. He continued to stand there, grinning that blackened grin, and I prayed that the train would come so soon so I could leave the man and that awful town behind. The bells were still sounding, but I could finally hear the horn in the distance. Finally, I muttered to myself, my eyes glued to the thing in front of me. He raised a hand and waved, slowly, wiggling each finger individually. I could feel the pace of my heart quicken. And then, suddenly, he took off at a dead sprint and launched himself onto the hood of my car. He thudded heavily on the metal. I jerked back in my seat and laid on my horn to let him know to get off my damn car, even though I knew it wouldn't work. He somehow stretched his lips across his teeth a little wider and started pounding on my windshield with his fists. Once, twice, over and over and over. The train was getting closer now. I could see it, and fissures began to crack the glass. I'll admit, I was scared. Who wouldn't be? He hit my windshield furiously, like he was desperate to get to me. I didn't want to know what he'd do once he got through the glass. The train was almost here, so I did the only thing I could think of and put the gear shift in reverse. I backed up a few dozen feet. The man was still banging on my windshield, howling like an animal, little pants escaping in between his grunts. The train was nearly in front of me. I floored the gas. The man held onto my car, his smile as wide as ever, but with a terrible anger in his eyes. I neared the tracks. The bells were ringing. I took my foot off the gas and slammed the brakes just a couple feet in front of the train, and the man flew off the hood of my car. His body propelled into the oncoming train. But I didn't watch to see where he landed, or if his body broke into smaller pieces. I slammed my hands on my steering wheel as the train took its time to pass, and I stomped on the gas pedal once more when it had finally gone. I probably should have stayed to tell the police what happened, but I didn't. I went home. I parked my car in the garage. I cleaned the blood from my grill, and the next day I took my car in to get the windshield replaced. I did my best to forget about it. I ignored the fear every time I got into my car. I drank myself to sleep so that I wouldn't dream. But I couldn't forget. And I didn't need to be asleep to see him again. I didn't drink one night, I guess. I dreamed of the man, howling, laughing, breaking through the glass of my car and hammering my body with his fists. His excited drool dripping onto my face, his oozing sores leaking into my mouth. I woke up in a cold sweat. And there he was, manifested at the foot of my bed. I hoped I was still asleep. I had to be, right? I slapped myself several times, but this wasn't a dream. I was awake. The man was dancing that same dance, whirling around my bedroom, the sound of the bells in my ears. And then he stopped. Hands suspended in the air. His black grin widened, and he turned to stare at me, excitement in his eyes this time. I froze. I couldn't get myself to move. My fear was palpable, stealing any governance I had of my own body. I didn't understand how the man could be here. He was dead, wasn't he? We stared at each other, a stalemate. The air was still. The only sound in the room was the clanging in my ears. And then, the man launched himself at me. He shoved me down and pummeled my chest, thrashing his fists against my ribcage. I felt a crack under my skin, and I gasped from the pain as he continued his assault. I remembered that I kept a bat by my nightstand, so I grabbed it and hit him over the head with it. He fell to the other side of my bed, and I stumbled to my feet, my chest feeling like fire and my lungs struggling to keep up with me. The man slid across my bed, slowly, and stood in front of me, body poised to pounce again. Then, the left side of his body lit up with light, as if a car's headlights were trained on him. The bells were ringing, the horn was blaring, and the man turned to look when his body was thrust into my wall. He landed with a wet thump on the floor. His body twisted so that I could see his face, even though his back was to me. My heart thudded painfully in my battered chest. What the hell had hit him? I stared at the body on my floor in horror and watched as it melted and disappeared. I left that night, packed a bag and tossed it in my trunk. I haven't been home since. I stayed in my car the first night at a truck stop. It's been motels ever since then. Never the same one for more than one night. I don't want to give him the chance to find me again, to finish what he started in my bedroom. But it doesn't matter where I am or what I'm doing. I always hear the sound of those goddamn bells. My mother always told me that I was a child of winter. I suppose it started from a young age. There are pictures and home videos of me as little more than a toddler, leaping into snowbanks and carving out tiny snow angels in my little neon blue snowsuit. When my sisters and brother, summer children, all of them, would beg my parents to return home so they could envelop themselves in blankets and gorge themselves in hot chocolate, I would remain indignant, refusing to leave my frosty playground behind. Even throughout adolescence, I was obsessed with a winter landscape. I loved the beauty of dancing snow flickering through the air, the way my small-town landscape became entombed in soft, billowing white. When I was 7 years old and stuck inside with the flu, missing a perfect snowy December afternoon, mind you, I discovered my grandfather's old 35mm film camera tucked between dusty packing boxes. It felt sturdy between my hands, like some old treasure. As soon as the flu left me, I took my new prize outside and began taking photos of my frigid wonderland. Leafless branches silhouetted against the evening sun, an unflowing frozen river beneath an old stony bridge, a red squirrel peeking its head out from a hole in a tree. The scenes that I had always loved, but had never had the chance to properly express to my friends or family. It was around this time that I met something. Even now, after all these long years, I can still remember everything that happened that day. I had been out in the small birch woods behind my parents' house, 9 years old and filled with glee. The first snowfall of the year had graced us the night before, signifying the dying breath of the tyrannical summer. Armed with my trusty camera, I had rushed out the door, my parents yelling at me through the kitchen window so that I would stay close to the house. But it was useless. The gentle snowfall intoxicated me, and within minutes I was out of sight of my house. The birch trees were barren and cracked, standing like emaciated giants far above me. Stepping into the woods felt like stepping into a painting. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a winter hare dart by. I aimed my camera, readying the perfect shot, but I stopped myself. I had taken plenty of pictures of hares before. No, I needed something better. This was the first shot of the season, after all. It had to be special. Decked out in green snowsuit and boots, I was almost certainly not blending in with my surroundings. Everywhere I went, I saw hares and squirrels, and even a few deer rushing away from me as if their lives depended on it. My young mind couldn't help but take it personally. Disney movies had led me to believe that animals were much friendlier than this. To my continued confusion, I saw a panicked squirrel run towards me, dart around my legs, and continue into the forest. Looking back, I can't believe how I didn't see the signs. Like a fool, I decided to explore the area where the animals were running from. Pushing branches from my face, I stepped into a clearing in the woods. And then I saw it. The most beautiful winter landscape I had ever encountered. I stood on the shoreline of the river that flowed behind my home. The sun hung low overhead, as if it was still working up the energy to finish rising. From where I stood, I could see the shore covered in perfect, untouched snow. Birch trees stood to my left and right, framing my peripheral with their skeletal grey branches and bone-white flesh. Before me stood the frozen river, almost entirely still beneath the blue-grey ice. Only a patch of the river still revealed the running water beneath the ice, having melted away by the lazy sun. The exposed water rippled with the sun's shining light, presenting me with a finishing touch to a perfectly composed photo of whites, blues, and oranges. The beauty of that simple scene left me breathless, and without a thought, I raised my camera, adjusted the dials, and took the shot. I didn't take another. I knew it was perfect. For a few moments, I just stood before this gift of nature, my youthful mind completely devoid of anything else. It took the sound of snapping branches to break me out of my trance. The sound had surprised me. I blinked my dry eyes a few times, turning away from my landscape. Behind me stood the entire birch forest, tall and immense. Though the woods had welcomed me earlier, I now felt uneasy looking at the maze of trees. I felt the hairs at the base of my neck creep up. I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. I thought I had seen one of the trees move. I gasped out, taking a step back toward the river. I kept my eyes glued on the woods. Nothing else moved. A cold wind blew across the ground, drifting it with a billowy top layer of snow. I felt that cold in my bones. To tell you the truth, I still do to this day. I took a few steps forward and stopped. Everything in my head told me not to go further, not to go back into the woods. But the shoreline that I stood upon was narrow. The only other way home would be across the ice. After minutes of panicked pondering, I forced myself to remember the beauty of the woods. The birch trees, which now looked as if they were jagged bones of the earth, were also the backdrop to so many happy childhood memories. The woods had been the setting for making snowmen with my sisters and brother, sledding, igloos, and of course my photography. With all the resolve I could muster, I shoved down the fear and stepped forward, though the hair on my neck stayed upright. As soon as I stepped between the trees, I felt the cold again. The frozen breath of winter awoken. I felt my teeth chatter, knees buckle. It wasn't natural, this cold. It stung my face, and I recoiled, pressing my jacket sleeve against it. I could feel tiny tears in the corner of my eyes, though they would freeze as soon as they appeared. I took shaky steps forward, wild eyes darting every time I heard a sound. The wind howled between the branches and the trees, quiet at first, and then louder as I walked. The trees moaned and shifted beneath the winter winds, a mournful cacophony of nature. I froze mid-step, my eyes wide and body stiff. In between the howling wind and creaking trees, I heard someone say my name. Not in the way a concerned parent calls out to you, or the way an annoying sibling tries to get your attention. No, there was no love in this familiar word. The voice I heard was creaking and slow, one I'd never heard before, nor wished to hear again. It wasn't a call, but a whisper, one that had somehow reached me, despite the eerie sounds of nature. I heard it again, closer. Either from the cold or from fear, I was frozen in place. Only my eyes would move where I would tell them to. My body was frozen like the landscape itself. Again, the whisper grew in my ears. I felt my already panicked breathing quicken. My name, again, whispered from behind me, getting closer. The sounds of my name were grotesquely stretched by the creaking voice, and I heard the hints of malice. And then, the woods was silent. No wind, no creaking trees, no spectral voice among the still snow. Something grabbed my shoulder. I felt terror rise in my throat in a hoarse, guttural scream. The something grasped me tightly, and pain shot through my shoulder. I darted my eyes down towards my shoulder. Fingers did not hold me. Long, grey appendages that bent at odd angles had pierced through my jacket. They looked like the barren and dead branches of the oak trees above me. The something whispered my name again, death in its voice. I screamed again, tearing my shoulder away. Despite the cold, I ran. With God as my witness, I ran. I ran through the snowbanks, over fallen trees and branches, in between patches of ice and bare earth. My steps were awkward from the height of the snow. I held my camera with both hands so as to not drop it, though without the use of my arms to balance myself, I nearly tripped multiple times. The sound of the winter winds picked up again with a furious roar, tearing through the trees behind me. I felt the torrent of wind pressed against my back, and I knew something was chasing me. Again, I felt the ice-cold, branch-like fingers touch me, brushing against the base of my neck. I could feel the cold tears against my cheek freeze as I threw my camera to the ground, using my arms to help balance myself. I ran faster as the something called out to me. My house came into view through the trees. "Help!" I had screamed. "Help! Help me!" "Help!" the something whispered behind me with its ghoulish, creaking voice. "Help! Help me!" I screamed in terror, exhaustion overcoming my lungs. I could feel the burning heat in my legs beg me to stop, to take a breather. but the edge of the forest came into sight, and, with an insane surge of fear-driven energy, I threw myself out of the forest and into my house's snow backyard. My parents, God bless them, were running from the house before I had even stood up. My flannel pajamas wearing mother had frantically thrown on her winter boots. My father ran through the snow barefoot, wearing only a robe. "Help!" I screamed again, my voice hysteric. "There's something in the woods." My parents caught me, held me as I screamed over and over. They tried to console me, to reassure me that everything was okay. And yet still I shouted, "Help! Help! Help me!" A few hours later, I was enveloped in a warm blanket with an untouched mug of steaming hot chocolate on the coffee table before me. My parents tried to calm me. They themselves were calmer now, but still deeply concerned for their terrified child. They told me that the woods were big and scary for a little one, and that it was okay to be afraid. When I told them of the whispered words, of the branched fingers on my shoulder, they told me that I'd imagined it. The whispers were just the sound of the wind across the snow. The holes in my jacket were from a low-hanging branch. My parents, truly the warmest, most logical people in the world, managed to calm me down. I started to believe that, just maybe, my experience in the woods had been the work of an overactive imagination. My sisters and brother even began teasing me for it, saying that the something would come take me away. And yet, despite my family's reassurance, I could not shake the feeling that they were wrong. Sometimes, when I looked out of the woods from my warm bedroom's window, I would feel the hair stand up as it had on that day. If I looked long enough, no matter how many blankets I had on, I would start to feel the creeping cold that had frozen me to my bones on that day. It took me 30 years and a lot of therapy to get over those memories. I was never comfortable going out in the winter by myself again. As I grew older, I left my northern home to move south for school and never looked back. Nowadays, I make a living as a nature photographer for a national magazine, specialized in old school film techniques, though I refuse to work anywhere that has snow during the winter season. A few days ago, I got a call from my aging mother. My father had recently passed, and she was selling our family house. My sisters, brother and I went up to visit to help her pack away our childhood memories. From my mother's front porch, I looked out at the woods, green and warm beneath the summer sun. Whether it was the time away or the lack of frozen death, I no longer feared this place. With my brother as backup, I went down to face my childhood fears. We walked for a while, reminiscing on our youth, pointed out to the areas where we made our snow angels and our forts, as well as the beach where we would swim during the summer. Filled with warmth, we were headed back towards the house, when I saw a glint of metal partially buried beside a tree. My old camera. Despite the fear I had felt that day, I remembered that perfect shot. The blues and the whites and the oranges. The last normal day of my youth. I picked up the camera, joking with my brother. I doubted the photo would look great after all this time, but I am something of a wizard when it comes to developing film. I returned down south. I developed the photo about 3 hours ago. To my surprise, it had only partial damage to it, blotching out the sun but leaving much of the shot intact. Reminiscing, I told myself that my parents had been right after all. Beneath the red light of the dark room, I had happily taken the sights in, reminding myself of the days of the young winter lover, marveling at the river, the snow, the trees. And that's when I saw it. Standing amongst the birch trees, hidden just behind, I saw a figure staring back at me. It was tall and incredibly thin, with a body that was the same waxy white as the trees that surrounded it. Its arms and legs were twice as long as its body, branch thin and grey as death. At the end of its limbs were the branch-like fingers that had torn into my jacket 30 years ago, thin and long and sharp. Atop its giant, emaciated body, the something's featureless, porcelain-white face stared back at me, as if through the photograph itself. Its eyes were black and white and empty. Its mouth a broken, jagged crack in the mask-like face. I fell onto the floor within my dark room, the horrible memories flooding back. I screamed, just as I had that day. I screamed and screamed and screamed until I could only whimper. I felt the cold, the hair on my neck, the horrible grasp of the something on my shoulder. My family won't believe me. My friends will think I'm insane. But I need to share this story now, because I don't think I have much time left. Because even though it's 30 degrees Celsius where I live, snow just began to fall outside my window. The group of us stood around the mechanical atrocity with bated breath and blank expressions. The twisted roots of cords and wiring sprawled the room tight like some twisted bird's nest. On the display board, a vibrant array of flickering lights performed their usual rounds as we all waited in eager anticipation. The performance ceased several seconds later, and a single message displayed on screen. Dr. Ammerman approached, and her curious hazel eyes parted like the Red Sea as her focus fell upon the message. She turned back to face Marek, our project lead. His grey eyes returned her stare with a gaze of laser-like intensity. Status? Ammerman takes a deep breath and shudders. Genome sequencing complete. Electrolysis fluctuation appears minimal. Power levels stable. She pauses and glances meekly back at him. I think it'll work. She spoke as if it was some deadly secret. Marek looked into the 2 glass testing canisters on the podium, and the rest of us followed suit. Within the right, a single white mouse with beady red eyes curiously squeaked about. Within the left was another mouse, mortally wounded with an open gash on its side. Small squeaks of pain escaped its frantic mouth, and its chest pulsed wildly as speckles of blood stained its pearly white fur. 2 diodes sat at opposite ends of each container, with poles facing one another at a 180-degree angle. Wires wrapped the room like a spider's web, with several haphazardly soldered connections and open circuits. OSHA would have had a field day with our setup, but beauty and proportionality were never top priority. Marek pondered in silence for a moment, and anticipation draped over us like a thick tarp. With a sudden grunt, Marek gives the command. Begin. Ammerman and another colleague spring into action, adjusting knobs and dials on the machine in accordance with specified parameters. The machine began to whir with electromagnetic energy and groaned as the antennae began to glow. Ammerman grabbed the power switch and gave a sudden, much more confident look back to the rest of us. Her eyes wandered to Marek, then locked with mine. I nodded back, and she turns to the switch. Firing! Ammerman activates the machine, and the room is bathed in a blue, iridescent hue as energy surged through the circuits. The testing chamber was consumed momentarily by a radiant ocean of azure. Within 10 seconds, it is over, and the room waits silently for the culmination of years of hard work. There had been thousands of attempts and thousands of failures. That time, though, something felt different. Whether it was a simple blithe hunch or the ever so slight smirk on Dr. Ammerman's face, something was unique that time. A commotion drew us back to the canister in between the two diodes. A squeaking sound. I stared in abstract belief as the previously injured mouse begins to rummage around its cage, showing no signs of discomfort or the previous wound. The mouse on the right, however, has been almost liquefied, reduced to a small pile of fluffy slag like a moldy marshmallow that has just been microwaved. A chorus of cheers then erupted from the group, all of them reveling in the majesty of what had just been accomplished. Marek, however, does not join in on the celebratory chorus. Without a word, he approaches the canister and kneels to its level. His eyes follow the mouse within as it squeaks and scurries about. After a few moments, he chuckles and fetches something from his coat pocket. His arm pulls back, wielding a small pocket knife. He presses the blade to his hand and slices horizontally across the outside of his hand. The skin splits apart, and a deep crimson begins to drip voluptuously from the wound. He doesn't so much as flinch. Ammerman gasps at the macabre display. Her eyes quiver as the blood trickles from Marek's hand and falls to the pearly white linoleum below. She takes a step towards him, but then hesitates. Marek removes the canister and grabs the small rodent, placing it into the canister on the right with its deceased counterpart. He places his wounded hand between the two diodes as the rest of us closely monitor his actions. He looks back to Ammerman, expression devoid of any emotion. Begin. Ammerman appears unsure of the command. Another voice, Dr. Fedor Oleski, chimes in. Sir, the proper diagnostics have not yet been completed. We don't know what— Pull the switch. Marek interrupts with a stern yet collected voice. His eyes glisten with a malicious urgency. In fear of further invoking his wrath, Ammerman complies with the order. The machine roars to life once again as the blood from Marek's hand pools upon the pulpit below the diodes. Ammerman again grabs the switch and looks to me. A simple nod signals my approval, as, even if I wanted to protest, I know there is no sense arguing with my older brother. She pulls the switch, and a stream of electricity blazes through Marek's hand. The room is once again illuminated by a neon blue. Marek winces for a moment, but remains stoic as the process concludes. The machine powers down seconds later, and tufts of smoke drift from Marek's hand. Smoke, but no blood. The previous wound had vanished, the only proof of it having ever existed being the pool of partially congealed blood on the testing podium. The previously healed mouse has been reduced to viscera, just as its counterpart before it. Marek withdraws his hand and raises it upwards into the faux lighting of the lab. He wiggles his fingers back and forth, and a small chuckle escapes his lips. The group, myself included, stare back in amazement as Marek turns to us, a wide, almost devious grin on his haggard face. Now I can become life, the creator of worlds. That moment should have been triumphant, celebratory for all of us at the impossibility that had been achieved. But the way Marek spoke was not one of just victory. It was one of conquest. One reminiscent of a medieval warlord bloviating to a fallen adversary who dared challenge his valor just before thrusting the blade through his chest. Marek's words, a blatant mockery of the illustrious J. Robert Oppenheimer, and a tabernacle solidifying his greatest achievement. Once again, there was no sense arguing with him. My older brother Marek has always been an eccentric man, dead set in his ways, and near impossible to convince otherwise. Anything and everything he does wholeheartedly and without lamentation, giving every ounce of energy he has to achieve that which he desires. It's one of the reasons why he has become a wealthy man, but not the only one. So, when he had first approached me, proclaiming he wished to orchestrate a method capable of reversing the entire deluge of human ailments, I didn't question him. Not on the intent anyways. I knew immediately he was serious. I pledged my funding to this group, curious to see what his plan was. For over a decade, we had nothing but failure. The initial machine relied on stimulant chemicals to try and expedite the body's natural healing processes. That idea was scrapped fairly early on, in favor of an electrolysis generator capable of completely overriding the body's own control of the cerebral cortex and manually initializing tissue rejuvenation. It restores the neural pathways and stimulates red and white blood cell production to rapidly reverse ailments of a host specimen. At least, that's about as much as I understand about the process. That was not enough though. We ran the experiment hundreds of times and achieved little else than searing the subject like a patty on the grill. Eventually though, a breakthrough did come. We realized the only way to generate enough power was by a transfer of energy from one living organism to another. No amount of raw electrical input was enough. A sacrifice had to be made. The occupants of the room file out of the lab one by one at the conclusion of the experiment, many of them bearing concern, but with nonetheless excited expressions. Several gossip with one another on the way out, but most remained silent. Ammerman was one of the last to leave, and avoided looking at either my brother or I as she departed. Soon enough, it is just Marek and I, alone in the room. "We've done it, Leo," he proclaims proudly. I turn to see him, and slowly he meets my gaze, a devious smile on his face. Death can no longer hold us. Injury no longer restrict us. We alone have achieved the impossible. I can't help but chuckle at his brooding monologue and almost maniacal tone. That's a bit presumptuous, wouldn't you say? We traded 1/4 of a megawatt for a mouse and a scrape. Not exactly energy efficient. Marek inspects his previously injured wrist, caressing it gently with his other hand. It never is in the beginning. This is just the first iteration. The process will be refined in the coming years, as it always is, and our names will be forever solidified into the annals of history. He turns entirely to face me, placing a firm hand on my shoulder. Can you picture it, Leo? Our names to the top of the list of prestigious men of science. Newton, Tesla, Franklin, Einstein. None can compare to what we have achieved. Mankind will no longer fear death. He pauses and takes a moment to revel in his self-bestowed accolades. Safe to say, the noble is ours for the next century. He and I share a laugh. Well, why stop there? I'm thinking big. Maybe a giant golden statue by the Washington Monument or something. Marek laughs, a genuine and hearty laugh that I have not heard him utter in years. That would be nice. Not since aspirin has the world seen something so profound, and when the world discovers what we have done, they will know true greatness. My brother is a bit of a megalomaniac, I know, but honestly, he's at least partially justified. I know it can rub people the wrong way, and I get that. But after all, we have accomplished what he has said. His machine, which he has so humbly dubbed as the Godsbane engine, has given us dominion over injury, and soon, death itself. This lab, this project, has all been orchestrated and funded solely by us. None in the mainstream world could be convinced to so much as entertain so outlandish an idea, but they're sure to be kicking themselves now. So, what now? What do you plan on doing with it? Marek falls silent again. He gives me a look that I have not seen in him. It's hard for me to quantify what expression conveys. A sorrowful look with a unique gleam in the eye. The type of look that says, you and I both know the answer to that. The last time I remember seeing it was when our mother passed away. It's for her, he responds simply. For a second, I thought he was referring to Ammerman, who I know he fancies privately to some extent. I turn to respond, but an epiphany strikes before I can speak. Beatrice? I ask. He doesn't respond, only maintains the same look. That's what all of this was for, isn't it? It's why you are so insistent upon this project? Not just this, Leo. Everything I have ever done. It's all for her. He stares back up at the machine, arms crossed and mind drifting from the moment. Marek, I don't know if it'll work that way, I add sheepishly. I know that breaking through this stubborn mental wall around him is almost futile. You'd have better luck convincing a crocodile to go vegan. Still, I have to try. It was made to work that way. You know that better than anyone. What is fixing a simple genetic abnormality when compared to saving the fatally wounded? Adjustments can be made. His glance turns almost contemptuous. It's not just abnormality. We're talking a lifetime of maldeveloped biology. Not just her mind, her body, her hands and feet. She wouldn't be able to handle the procedure. Then it would be better to let her die, would it? Marek suddenly shouts back. I've seen him furious before, but rarely is his ire directed solely at me. I can tell by the frenzied look in his eye that he is desperate. I am as well, of course. Beatrice is the most important thing in the world to me, but I have to be realistic. He steps closer. We are running out of time, Leo. She has already far exceeded the average lifespan of someone with her condition. Her life has been nothing but torment, restricted by the cruel hands of fate. Would you be able to live with yourself if you knew there was something you could have done and didn't? I don't answer his question, instead choosing to avert my gaze to the ground. Marek steps away and takes a deep breath. This is what we've always wanted. This is no longer just our investment. This is now our duty. To abandon now would be absolute treachery. She deserves everything we can give her. I struggle to find a retort to his words, partly because I know him to be correct on some level. From the initial onset of our project, I suspected this was about her. The way Marek insisted upon utilizing cerebral cortex revitalization and the use of the neural electroencephalogram betrayed his true motives. This was always about her, and everything we did was to prepare us for it. What was I to do? Allow her to suffer and succumb to the sands of time when we hold the Holy Grail in our palms of our hands? Marek is right. It has to be done. There is no guarantee she will be able to handle the procedure. Marek's expression doesn't waver an inch at the suggestion. There is no guarantee of anything. When has that ever stopped us? It's clear he has already rehearsed this exact moment, and I know nothing I say will dissuade him. It's going to take a lot of energy, probably a few megawatts, not to mention donors equivalent to at least 5,000 grams of glutamate. Marek shifts in his stance and eyes me. Better do 6, just to be sure, he replies. That's a lot of animals, I reply. Marek nods, unheeded by the obstacle. You leave that to me. For now, tell the crew to prepare for the procedure. Call me if anything else should arise. I got some things to take care of. Marek turns and begins to exit the lab. I stare up at the Godsbane and contemplate the task awaiting us. How do you plan on generating that much electricity? I ask. Marek pauses as he reaches the door, and without turning, he responds, a demonstration. Beatrice is Marek and I's younger sister, a beautiful, happy girl of only 21 years old, with short, curly brown hair and a smile which could turn the most bitter of hearts into saints. Mom always used to tell us that you do not receive a gift without a curse. For Beatrice, I see no gift worth that of the curse she bears. Her condition comes in the form of an insidious birth defect known to the medical world as lissencephaly, a spiteful neurological disease characterized by the absence of convulsions in the cerebral cortex. It results in an underdeveloped brain, smaller than normal cranium, mental impairment, and severe motor skill inhibition. The person diagnosed with the disease will forever be unable to fend for themselves, becoming completely dependent upon those who care for them. They are locked in an infantile existence and cannot ever lead normal lives. And, as I'm sure you can imagine, there is no cure. Beatrice does not walk. She does not talk. But her smile says everything you ever need to hear. The prospect of her being born the way she was never sat well with Marek. I know he's been devastated by it, but I had no idea the extent of his disdain. We've always done our best to provide Beatrice with a modicum of comfort, but there's only so much that can be done to abate the grand mal seizures and perpetual sickness. Resentment of life is a standard ploy to distract from the possibility of malicious design from an apathetic creator. It's one of the many reasons I no longer attend church. The necessary adjustments have been made by the team. All the wires and circuits need to be beefed up in order to handle the amplified amount of power which would flow through them. The exit diodes also need readjustment in order to allow space required to accommodate a human specimen. Now is our time to seize Mother Nature by the throat. A plethora of businessmen and women, prestigious scientists and engineers, along with wealthy philanthropists and CEOs file into the room to witness our presentation. Their expressions dotting with a mix of uncertainty and doubt. I do not know what they have been told, but I know nothing can prepare them for what they are about to see. After a half hour of meager conversation and questions, Marek finally enters the room. Silence befalls the group as he strolls confidently to the front of the lab. He pauses and turns, his Godsbane engine looming behind him in all its blasphemous glory. He clears his throat and begins. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you all to our humble laboratory. Before you stands a revolutionary new type of machine, one which can reverse disease, heal injury, and save people from the brink of death. I give you the Godsbane engine." He pauses and gestures up to the mechanical leviathan behind him, its form now appearing less like a machine and more like an altar. He is met with a round of hesitant applause from the 50-odd guests in attendance. Today, ladies and gentlemen, you will witness a miracle, an absolute marvel of technology, and the very first of its kind. A hand suddenly sprouts upward from the audience, a balding white man with glasses and a curious demeanor. Marek nods to him. "This machine, it can reverse death?" he asks skeptically. Marek nods, and the man seems to contemplate a moment. "Is that wise to do? Morally speaking, how do you think the world will react if what you claim is true?" Marek pauses for a moment, before a knowing smile slithers across his face. "It's not a question of morality, it's a question of reality. Science and medicine has always tampered with order. We have a duty to our fellow man to push the envelope. We always have. It is our burden to bear." Marek stands confidently, and no one else seems willing to question his resolve. I look around the room and suddenly come to the realization that Dr. Ammerman is not present. None of the crew is, as a matter of fact. Only Marek's personal guards, whom I do not recognize. Another hand then sprouts up from a woman with gilded hair and wrinkles beneath her eyes. "How exactly does it work?" Marek smiles, as if that was the question he was waiting to hear. "Easier to show than it is to tell." Marek gestures to his men, and they begin ushering people towards the seats. "Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you would be so kind as to take your seats, we are about to begin." The audience does as instructed and relocate into the crude metallic seats. They look almost like thrones, but barebone and rigid. Marek's men then begin passing out some sort of helmet device to each of them. "My assistants are supplying you with our state-of-the-art shielding apparatus. The arc flash produced by the machine can be quite intense, and this device is to protect your eyes from the lighting. Please ensure your helmet is equipped, snug and comfortable, with the protective lenses placed across your eyes." The audience begins doing as requested, and Marek's guards assist them. I saunter over to his side and whisper to him, "You made no mention of this before." Marek chuckles and replies in a hushed tone, "Insurance purposes, to cover our ass from any lawsuit they may try to bring." He gives me a pat on the back and turns back to the group as they finish their preparations. Marek raises both hands and begins again. "Now, ladies and gentlemen, the show is about to begin. Please welcome the star of our show, my beloved younger sister, Beatrice." The door opens behind him, and those seated turn to glimpse the commotion. In strolls Dr. Ammerman, pushing Beatrice in a wheelchair. Beatrice smiles as she recognizes Marek, but Ammerman appears nervous. Marek approaches Beatrice and kneels to her level. "Hi, Bea." A smile forms on his face, and he kisses her forehead. Beatrice gives a small hoot of excitement and eagerly squirms about. Ammerman steps away and appears confused by the sight of the audience in their bizarre helmets. She turns to me. "Oh, insurance," I state, echoing Marek's explanation. Ammerman appears no less confused and glances around the room. "Where are the animals?" she asks. I forgot all about that aspect, and I have no answer to give. Before I can respond, Marek begins to speak once again. "I'd like to introduce you all to my dear sister Beatrice. She was born with a disease known as lissencephaly. a cruel diagnosis which had left her incapable of living a full life. That changes today. With a Godsbane engine, she will be free from her shackles. Marek nods to Ammerman, but she remains frozen. Marek's gaze quickly turns sour, and Ammerman, fearing repercussions, approaches and pushes Beatrice and her wheelchair to the designated spot, right between the two output diodes, in the crux of the Godsbane. Beatrice's expression appears somewhat nervous as she is placed within the designated spot. I walk over to her, give her a kiss on the forehead, and try reassuring her. "It's okay, Bea. We're gonna make things better." Beatrice smiles up at me, and Marek readies the machine for the procedure. Ammerman shuffles quietly behind the machine and stands at the switch. Her eyes appear to tremble as she scans the room. Marek approaches Beatrice and gently caresses her hand. He whispers something to her, but I didn't hear what he said. Marek then turns from her and meets my gaze with an almost diabolic grin. I feel a cold chill descend my spine as I see his expression. But Marek will not be swayed. He turns to Ammerman. "Begin." Ammerman hesitates. "Sir, where are the—" "It has all been taken care of, Dr. Ammerman. There is no need to worry." "But what about—" "Begin the procedure." His look turns to an immediate scowl, as if the scorn of 1,000 men rested behind his eyes. Ammerman recoils, and with a sigh she begins the startup process. The generators begin to whir with electrical impulse, a noise that grows steadily louder. Overhead, the armature begins to rotate faster and faster as sparks of neon blue begin to ignite and lash out. The whirring becomes so loud that Marek is forced to shout over the commotion. The first step requires building enough power for a sustainable transfusion. Once the core is stable and power levels are primed, the next step begins. The audience appears slightly unnerved by the sight, and the ferocious machine continues to roar overhead. Marek then throws another switch, and a series of mechanical straps emerge from the seats. They jut across the lap of the audience members and restrain them down in their seats. Fear crosses their faces, and several begin to audibly protest. Marek raises his hand to quell the mounting uncertainty. "All part of the plan, ladies and gentlemen. There is no need to worry. This is a precaution for your safety." Overhead, a series of tube-like structures descend from the rafters and latch themselves to the helmets of the audience members. Beatrice begins to cry as the cacophony of the machine reaches hurricane proportions. "Marek, what are you—" I question. "Do not get in the way, Leo," he suddenly shouts in a hushed tone back at me, his eyes now burning holes through me as the restrained audience members begin to visibly panic. "What is this? This wasn't part of the plan." Marek's expression turns to outright anger as the years of seething resentment can no longer be contained within him. "This was always part of the plan." He turns from me once more and raises both arms. "You see, ladies and gentlemen, raw electrical input is not enough. It is only part of the equation. To make the transfer successful, you need a small dose of life." Marek then throws the final switch, causing a new noise to fill the lab. The sound of horrendous screams. I watch horrified as the men and women strapped to the seats flail and writhe around as the tubes begin to glow brightly above them. "Marek, stop!" Ammerman begs, but Marek isn't listening. A new diabolic grin forms on his face, and I see the sheer madness swirl in his eyes. Ammerman moves to impede him, when Marek forcefully seizes her by the throat. He hurls her backwards, causing her to stumble and bash her head on a nearby desk. She falls to the ground, unconscious. "What the hell are you doing?" I rush towards Ammerman. when Marek seizes me. I feel his fist strike my ribs, and as I haunch over in pain, his knee rises to slam into my face. I feel my nose burst like a balloon, and a splatter of blood erupts from my nose. I feel my consciousness fading when Marek seizes me by the collar. Apologies, brother, but I cannot allow anyone to intervene, not even you. Behind me, I hear the continued sounds of gurgled screams from the audience. This is wrong, I manage to stutter out. Marek laughs and shakes his head. No, Beatrice is wrong. I will make her whole. Marek then releases me, and I fall back. My fading vision falls upon the audience. Their bodies and faces have begun to melt away, like candles in an oven. Their agonized screams and gurgles continue, as one by one, they fall silent. Outside, a group of their bodyguards attempt to pry the door open, but to no avail. The room begins to grow vibrantly as the neon blue grows to consume everything. It grows so bright that I can no longer see my hand in front of my face. Beatrice, I release you from your chains, Marek shouts, his voice overcoming all the rest of the chaotic symphony before the room erupts with a massive concussion of raw energy. I can feel the breath knocked from my chest and the room tremble as a wave strikes me. I gasp as I try to regain my rhythm, blinded by the light. The neon blue slowly fades, leaving a pile of partially liquefied corpses in its wake. All the audience members have since fallen silent, their slack-jawed expressions partially skeletonized as melted flesh drips from their bones. Marek stands back up on the other end of the room, his head now sporting a gaping wound. His eyes then grow enormous, and I turn to see what holds his attention. Beatrice sits in a wheelchair, smoke bristling off her like the vapor on a lake in a cold winter's day. Something about her has changed. Her skin has turned a ghostly white, as if it were carved from the most immaculate marble. Her head suddenly appears the size of a normal person's, as her arms and legs no longer bear the signs of muscular atrophy. She appears whole, as we had always hoped. Her blue jumpsuit she wore has been tattered and no longer seems to properly fit. Around her sprouts an almost angelic aura of shimmering light. The air distorts around her like heat waves on a hot summer day. Then, Beatrice does something I never would have thought I'd see in a million years. My little sister, who all her life had suffered from her ailment and has never taken a single step, rises from a wheelchair of her own accord. I stare, mouth gaping and eyes anchored open as she strolls out of the Godsbane. Marek rises, his expression matching my own bewilderment. Beatrice, he says, almost in a whisper, and tears well in his eyes. Her head then turns in his direction, her eyes still shut. She stands at least an entire foot taller than him. Her body is lanky and narrow, and seems to emanate an immense power beyond any I've ever witnessed. He strolls over to her, his hand gently reaching out. On the main lab door, the sound of men attempting to break in emerges, but Marek pays them no mind. Welcome home, sister. Marek's hand reaches for her cheek. Her eyes then spring open, revealing two blue orbs that glisten like stars. Marek pauses, then retracts his hand. Beatrice then reaches her hand towards him, and the security team manages to breach the door. Stop right there, one of the four men in suits commands. Beatrice slowly turns towards them, her glowing eyes falling upon the group. The men hold their pistols with trembling grips, and the one who shouted the command appears to shudder. "Doctor, we need you to stand down," he commands, but his voice wavers. Marek pays him no mind whatsoever as his gaze is transfixed upon Beatrice. Beatrice raises a hand to Marek and caresses his cheek gently. Marek grasps and suddenly appears uncertain. Within moments, his body begins to fade, like blood diluting in a bucket of water. One moment is there, the next, he's gone. One of the guards suddenly pulls the trigger, and a deafening blast erupts as the bullet screams out of the barrel. It strikes Beatrice in the chest, and my heart freezes. Blood begins to drip from the wound, but Beatrice doesn't even seem to register the impact. I expect her to collapse, as the shot should have been fatal, but she continues to stand. Beatrice then turns her head back to the men. Her mouth then slowly dangles open, stretching impossibly wide for any normal human. But she isn't a normal human anymore. Dozens of small tufts of blue light emerge from within her throat and begin to gently flutter outward. "What the hell are you?" one man asks. As if on cue, the balls of light suddenly jettison towards them in a torrid rate. The balls strike the men, one after another, and they begin to scream. They writhe about as their eyes, mouths, nostrils, and ears begin to emit the same blue light. They fall to the floor soon after, silent and unresponsive. I blink, and suddenly, Beatrice has appeared only 2 feet from me, her iridescent eyes staring down, expressionless upon me. I gasp and raise my arms, as if hoping in some futile attempt to protect myself. "Beatrice, I'm so sorry." She kneels down to me, her hand reaching out and touching my shoulder. Her touch burns like napalm and freezes like dry ice at the same time. Hot and cold, dead and alive. I squirm as the uncomfortable sensation ingrains into my shoulder. I look back up to her, tears drifting from my eyes. "Thank you, Leo." Her voice like smooth silk upon the rusted chassis of my heart. Her tone is one which infuses a pit of despair within me, but also hope. A feeling I can never truly describe properly. I shudder at the sight of her, as if I'm looking upon a living, breathing miracle. Not one of the powers of God, but one born of science and machines. A living goddess, transcendent beyond the human form. She turns away from me, eyeing the morbid scene around us. The godsbane has since fallen silent, and Ammerman begins to stir. She then gasps, and her eyes tremble as she beholds Beatrice in all her heretical glory. Beatrice only gives her a quick glance, before slowly strolling towards the door of the lab. I watch her go, able to move, but without the willpower to follow. I watch her vanish beyond the mangled doors of the lab, unable to follow her out. I get my personal things together and get out of there as soon as I was able. The devastation of our audience took on an entirely new perspective as I leave, and I gag as the smell of viscera strikes my nostrils. The severity of what we had done hits me then. I can never atone for what I've done. Police seized our lab soon after, but the news made no mention of the event. By the time they arrived, I, and whoever else valued their freedom, were long gone. I have no idea what they truly know, but I doubt it is the whole story. No one would believe it anyway. They have, of course, tried to find me, but they haven't. I am a world away from that place now. New name and identity. I thought Marek was dead after that. But I got a phone call from him not too long ago. he's out there somewhere, serving his new goddess. I haven't actually seen him or Ammerman since, but I have seen her. I dream about her almost every night. It's all fuzzy, but I know it's her. Our little princess, molded into something else. I see her creating, see her suffering, and see her crying. I don't know why she shows me the things she does, but I know what she's doing. She is building something. A world to call her own beyond that of her own. She's not human anymore. Not really. Perhaps vaguely in appearance, but her mind and power has gone far beyond that of any other. She's out there, using the power we bestowed upon her, and there is no stopping her now. A being of tragedy and love, of chaos and empathy. The Nightmare Princess, a goddess in her own right. She keeps taking people, and I cannot stop her. I'm sorry for what I've done, but I can honestly say I wouldn't have it any other way. She deserves to be free, and now she's freer than anyone else has ever been before. All hail Beatrice, the Nightmare Princess. And now, the real work begins.